Hello, I would like to welcome everyone to our first Digital Fridays. This is our first kickoff. We're very excited. I want to introduce Frankie Mastrangelo. Frankie is a PhD candidate in media, art, and text at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on neoliberal feminism and digital economies. Her favorite TV show right now is Pen 15, and she likes talking about critiques of white feminism and capitalism. I will remind you that if you have questions, you can type your questions inside of the chat function, or you can simply raise your hand and we will call on you to raise your question or comment. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Frankie, who's going to lead our discussion on mental health and self-care in grad school. All right, Frankie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So happy that you all had me here today. Thank you to HASTAC for giving me the opportunity to do this. Just to introduce myself a little bit, my name's Frankie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a PhD candidate in media, art, and text, as Adashima noted, and just to give you a little sense of why I chose this topic, I became interested in having more discussions about mental health with grad students. Really at the end of the first year of my master's program, it felt like there was this one day that was a significant turning point where everyone sort of turned to each other and in some variation expressed how we felt like a mess. And, we were basically like, I feel like I'm not measuring up. I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I don't belong here. And it felt like that conversation really sparked a lot of future conversations for me that, just essentially opened a door to talking with other grad students where we just really let it out and felt like we didn't need to, try to pretend to be this poster child of, having it all together. And that really led to much closer friendships and feelings of community with other grad students. So this webinar is really an effort to continue building that sense of community and solidarity with more people in academic spaces and beyond. So with that said, I am not a mental health professional, but I'm really just sharing insights and experiences as a grad student that has personally struggled with my mental health. So first, I want to just give a little bit of an overview to contextualize why I think these conversations are important. I think that these conversations are important on both personal and structural levels. So many of you, I'm sure, have seen articles emerge, and it feels like really in the last year, I've seen a lot of articles around, the grad student mental health crisis. Studies show that grad students are 6 times more likely to experience anxiety and depression. So I think that, a lot of this conversation is coming on the heels of, these studies being done around, grad student mental health. But really anyone that's navigated academic spaces as a grad student is, I'm sure, familiar with, those feelings of pressure and isolation, financial strain, all of these factors that, you would imagine would go into, facilitating feelings of, anxiety and depression. So I want to raise the issue today of how I see institutional structures really contributing to those feelings. And consider what advocating for greater accessibility, support, and setting boundaries looks like. And I think the first step is having conversations about mental health in order to hopefully shift the culture of academia to being more inclusive, accessible, and supportive. Okay. So, topics that we'll discuss today. So first, we're going to get into institutional demands, expectations, and norms, and consider the impact that those have on our mental health. We'll also think about how institutional dynamics can facilitate greater accessibility and support, brainstorm a little bit of that. We'll also get into imposter syndrome, that lovely syndrome that so many of us deal with. And I think talking about imposter syndrome is a key step in grappling with it and or pushing back against it. And then we'll close out with some thoughts on familiar self-care discourse. So thinking about how those conversations can be limiting and ways we can open up those dialogues to be more honest and more useful. So I'll talk for about 30 minutes and then leave some good time, about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. But, note that if you do have a question, want to throw it in the chat box during the conversation, feel free to do that too. Cool, so let's first think about how institutions create constraints for how we deal with mental health. I think the first and most pressing is the need for programs to prioritize healthcare for grad students. I feel like I would be remiss in not noting that, pushing conversations about this forward, in grad student organizations, grad student unions, any budgetary meetings that feel relevant is definitely crucial. And with that said, I have healthcare through Marketplace. Like, my institution offers us funding, but they don't offer us healthcare, which I, see as an issue. And, I feel with that fortunate that the university counseling services at my institution are really excellent. And therapy has grown to become an important part of my grad school experience as a result. And it's helped me realize that I'm not alone in feeling like, man, I do so much all the time. I'm meeting milestones for my program successfully. I feel like I'm doing a good job with teaching and connecting with students, feeling like they're responding to course material in meaningful ways. But it caused me to question, why do I feel like I'm constantly messing up or just not measuring up, just not doing good enough? There's this sort of looming sense of, just not measuring up. And I appreciate every single grad student that I've ever had conversations with about this, because it's really highlighted to me that other grad students tend to have similar feelings. And, realizing that you're not alone in those feelings and that those sentiments speak to a common grad student experience, it really points to the need to look at this issue through a more broader lens. Like, why is this such a common grad student experience? Especially, from an outsider perspective, it may come across that, you're excelling, you're doing great. But from the perspective of the grad student, very commonly, they, see themselves as not doing well and not measuring up. So I've got a few thoughts on this, why this, is such a common grad student experience. So one, I think institutional demands ask a lot of us, of course. But with that, I think that we're made to feel that we should be working 24/7. I think that the notion of, not having a very clear 9-to-5 workday for academics can facilitate this sense that you should or could just be, working around the clock, and, always looking to complete the next academic milestone, whether it's, publishing an article, developing a new syllabi. There's this sense that you could always be reading, you could always be writing, you could always be doing something. And that is really toxic. So I think that is part of, the culture of academia, and it's something that really needs to, it really warrants discussion. And then with that, I think that it calls into question how we can exercise and practice healthy boundaries. And, you know, healthy boundaries look different for everyone. You know, it can look different based on, you know, whether, you know, you're managing a family, you know, thinking about all of the factors that may go into, you know, what it looks like for you personally to have boundaries with, you know, your academic workspace. It does vary, but it's really important to consider what that looks like for you, because nobody's going to determine that. If you let other people determine that for you, you will be working 24/7. So when I say institutional demands, I'm also thinking about the structures of grad school that don't really make space for grad students with disabilities. And it's important to note that I'm thinking about disability in an expansive way here, to include, you know, not just physical disabilities, but, you know, neurodivergent folks. So thinking about, you know, people that experience anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, depression, you know, myself included. So, you know, when we consider disability through that broader lens, it really opens up thinking about what do grad student spaces need to look like for us in order to be more accommodating. So, you know, there's obviously physical inaccessibility of buildings. You know, it's very important to make sure that, you know, a particular structure, you know, everyone can get in the building. And for those of us that work on older, you know, campuses with older buildings, you know, that's always a concern. But also thinking about the accessibility of the space for folks with neurodivergence. So the most glaring example that I think of that comes to mind immediately is, you know, the seminar classroom space and, you know, the expectation of sitting for multiple hours and, you know, maintaining focus on the course material or the discussion that's happening. And thinking about, you know, for folks with ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder, maybe at the beginning of the semester, just opening up the conversation to, you know, emphasize that if you need to get up and walk around during the conversation, that could be really helpful for folks with ADHD, that just moving around during a conversation can help them stay focused. For folks with obsessive compulsive disorder, like maybe doodling or, you know, not looking at, you know, the person speaking, but like maintaining focus by looking at a laptop. So those are just some, you know, examples that I think of when it comes to broadening the scope of accessibility in grad school spaces. So I think that there is also, you know, this pressure to not talk about mental health in academic spaces. And I think that, you know, when we're thinking about the culture of silence that I think happens around academia when it comes to just talking about encouraging greater accessibility and shifting norms, it really starts with just being able to have the conversation. And I think that there is such a strong pressure in grad school to create the appearance that you have everything 100% together, that, you know, you are on top of everything that you need to do, when the fact of the matter is that I think we're all variations and gradients of some form of a mess. So I think that my first step to really cultivating genuine friendships with other grad students was being like, hey, I feel like a mess in this way or that way. And it creates space for other folks to, you know, resonate with you and, you know, be like, hey, me too, I feel like a mess in this way. And I think really embracing that it's okay to not feel like you have a total balance over everything, because I think there's sort of a mythos around what it looks like to have a balance. But yeah, I have found that it's very liberating to embrace that, yes, you don't need to have it together all the time. You know, being like, hey, I feel like a mess in these ways. But when I think about institutional demands in academia as well, I also think about how the culture of academia really does promote these senses of, urgency, pessimism, and rigidity. So I think urgency really manifests in, the pressure to meet milestones and be competitive. There's a lot of pessimism about the job market. I'm sure that all of us have experienced this sense of doom and gloom from, our institutional spaces related to the job market. And I think that, that sense of doom and gloom can, I think that there can be more mindfulness, like on the part of like mentors and, the folks that their perspective does hold a lot of weight to us. To, think about how being continuously surrounded by the doom and gloom of the job market, it's helpful to pair that with, bright spots of like encouragement. I understand the desire to be realistic, but I think the weight of the pessimism can definitely hurt us at times. And I also think that there's a very intense sense of rigidity about being a particular scholar if you want to be tenure track. And with that, not really acknowledging and discussing alternative academic paths. So this feeling of needing to be a particular scholar, be a particular person in order to get that tenure track job. There's obviously certain milestones that you need to hit, but I think that that sense of putting us into boxes that, you need to be a tenure track scholar in this particular way. I think that the combination of all of these things, the urgency, the pessimism, and the rigidity can create a sort of like pressure cooker for us as grad students. And I'm curious in the Q&A later to hear more about how you all experience those sorts of sentiments like urgency, pessimism, and rigidity, because I think that it impacts us all in different ways, while also maintaining, sort of a common grad student experience. So, in thinking more about what feelings and experiences contribute to grad school kind of seeming like this pressure cooker where everyone has it together but you, I want to explore imposter syndrome a little bit. My beautiful picture there of a dog experiencing imposter syndrome amongst the flowers. Imposter syndrome is a psychological term referring to a pattern of behavior where people doubt their accomplishments and have a persistent, often internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. So, despite having degrees, awards, fellowships, assistantships, great grades, mentors, opportunities, you continuously think that you're undeserving of your success. This phenomenon is particularly prevalent among POC and women academics, which I think points to how norms around, perfectionism, rigidity, and competition have racialized and gendered dimensions. So it's important to consider how those ideals shape the academic institution. And academia is, after all, an institution that centers whiteness and male voices. So those things, go hand in hand. So we could go real deep with theorizing all those facets of imposter syndrome. But I do want to highlight some concrete personal experiences of imposter syndrome in order to highlight what it's all about and how it functions. So with permission, I'm going to share some brief experiences of imposter experiences from other grad students to showcase what imposter syndrome is. So not yet. So my friend Priya, who now works as a lecturer at UNC Charlotte, writes, I have found that the further I go in my program, the worse my imposter syndrome becomes. You would think as I sit on steering committees, join a department as new faculty, or participate in conferences, I would feel more confident about the breadth of my knowledge and the ideas I am putting forth. But I have found the opposite to be truth. I find myself struggling to keep up, am intimidated by the knowledge of others, constantly question the validity of my arguments, and in typical imposter syndrome fashion, worry all the time that they will find out that I am not really qualified. Many people have talked about how teaching requires you to perform, but for those suffering from imposter syndrome, part of that performance is trying desperately to cover all your angles while circling around certain topics because you fear that a student's question will expose you as a fake. When I got hired, I even managed to ask one of my committee members if I was a diversity hire because I couldn't believe my luck in getting the position. All of this to say that imposter syndrome never really gets better, and people of color tend to internalize it more than others because they're constantly surrounded by people who don't look like them. So how can they ever really feel like they belong? Imposter syndrome can be crippling. I don't know how many days now I've avoided working on my dissertation because my self-doubt is overwhelming. I force myself to speak up in meetings and on committees because it is the best way I know how to honor those women and people of color who came before me and ensure that the path is made a little bit easier for those who will come after me. The best advice I can give is to be vocal about your feelings, and most of all, be kind to yourself. You deserve all the wonderful things in your life and many more. I too am working on convincing myself of that. So Priya's experiences definitely showcase how representation ties into the experience of imposter syndrome for POC academics in particular, which ties back to institutions centering whiteness. Her indicating the ways that imposter syndrome, shows up beyond grad school, I think really highlights the culture of academia. When she emphasized the need to be vocal and speak up about this stuff, I thought of how the culture of academia really does inspire this silence, around these issues that I was referring to. We tend to think that we're alone in feeling like imposters, and isolation, I think, really exacerbates those feelings, because so many of us, I think that the work that we're doing is so often done in isolation as well. So not really having a lot of forums to talk with other grad students in very honest capacities, it can really make us feel like we're alone in those feelings, which just makes imposter syndrome feel that much more pronounced. Because you're like, I'm the only one experiencing this, but you're not. So my own experiences with imposter syndrome also resonate with Priya related to teaching, in that I find myself engaging in a lot of negative self-talk after I teach. So I tend to zero in on what I could have done differently or better, as opposed to focusing on what went really well that day. I think since teaching is this realm where you're seen as having the expertise, and there can be a lot of pressure and imposter feelings that come with being put in that position. So, I aim to have a student-centered classroom where student perspectives really shine and they're not drowned out by this lecturing expert. So navigating these dynamics for me means facilitating with confidence, and not lording knowledge over people as an expert. But I'll often feel like I take off my confidence hat once I leave the classroom, and I really nitpick myself. And my friend Jeanette gave me this idea of keeping a teaching journal where I note the things that went well on a given teaching day to stay grounded and not consumed by imposter syndrome. So speaking of Jeanette, she offered me an example of how she's experienced imposter syndrome that she gave me permission to share. So she said, After every seminar class for the first few weeks of our PhD program, I would call my friend Haley and tell her how much more prepared and well-read everyone around me was. I'd go home and cry, thinking about how I was going to let everyone that wrote me a letter to get into this program down. And I felt like this was the time that everyone would find out that I was a fraud and failure, and I was only here because I was nice. So Jeanette's experiences really speak to that imposter sense of being a fraud, not believing in your accomplishments. Like, you obviously got into that program, you should be there. But that feeling of not measuring up once you are there, and hearing these experiences from my friends, it makes me feel upset that my friends that are brilliant doubt themselves, even though I do the same thing. But it also gives me a sense of solidarity and, the sense of camaraderie with them, because I do share similar sentiments, and it makes me feel like I'm not alone. Like, I'm not totally in my head that, these are thoughts like, that I have as well. So I think about how we all go through this experience of imposter syndrome in some way, shape, or form. How we experience it is informed certainly by social identity and experience, but it feels like, we've all experienced the imposter bug. And I think an initial step to moving beyond imposter syndrome, or just grappling with it in authentic ways, is to share how we experience it with one another. Creating that space to be vulnerable is really powerful. So, on the topic of creating space, I want to move into what it looks like to create space for ourselves. But before I move into some ideas for self-care, I want to note how self-care has become kind of a buzz phrase. I'm sure you all recognize this. There's a lot more conversation about self-care now. And I think there's buzz around this idea for a few reasons. I think that, there are obviously more mainstream conversations around mental health, which is great. What I don't think is great about these conversations is how it really individualizes mental health issues and support in ways that it deflects from the need for community support. And it also deflects from institutional structures like academia needing to change in order to prioritize people's mental health. So, it places the onus of responsibility, I think, on the individual to take care of their mental health, as opposed to thinking about mental health in more structural, systemic terms. So, like a bubble bath is not going to change, your consistent drive towards perfectionism and feelings of inadequacy. That's a product of navigating these institutions that we navigate. But with that, I think that while changing structures in academia is definitely part of the mental health conversation for grad students, I want to support strategies for grad students to feel better as they navigate these structures. So, that was my critique of self-care before I get into more of a conversation about self-care. So some strategies that therapists and friends have shared with me are, let's think about like self-check-ins. Like, what does a self-check-in look like for us, and a genuine self-check-in at that? So like, taking a few minutes to name your feelings, and that can be, in a journal, or just taking, some quiet space for yourself. And in that space, brainstorming what you need to calm yourself or gain motivation. It can be setting intentions. It's generally a quiet space to account for your emotions, needs, and goals. And with that, giving yourself space to really hold feelings of overwhelm and anxiety. So, for instance, like after a stressful meeting, taking some time to think, hey, wow, that was stressful. What exactly stressed me out about it? what do I need to move forward and calm down, as opposed to, you know, going into traffic and getting road rage because of the meeting. But yeah, so I mean, oftentimes a check-in like that with yourself is better than just trying to power through feelings or, you know, ignoring overwhelming feelings. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got from a PhD student while I was in my master's program was that you need to make time for anxiety. Whether that time is a few minutes or whether that time is, you know, you are so overwhelmed that you just need to take the night off and not think about writing, whatever that means to you for the particular situation at hand. So another self-care strategy that I've considered and tried out is gratitude lists, a few different kinds of gratitude lists. So the traditional gratitude list is pretty self-explanatory. So like taking a few minutes to just write out a quick list of things that you're grateful for at that particular time, you know, whatever it is for you. A self-gratitude list, and bear with me because this can sound like a little bit cheesy and goofy at first, but I promise you that it can be really helpful. So a self-gratitude list is listing out all the things about, or not all the things, some things about yourself that you're grateful for. So for instance, you might put on the list like, I am a caring partner, or, you know, I'm a good friend that shows up for my friends. And it may be related to something particular that happened in that day that evidences that. The first time or two that I did this, I thought of that Saturday Night Live skit with Al Franken, if anybody's seen that, where, you know, he holds up a mirror and he's this sort of caricature of a self-help person and says, you know, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. It felt a little bit like that, but it gets less goofy and it's actually really sincere and a great way to check in with yourself. So something I think is really important too is valuing creative outlets outside of academia, because academia can swallow you whole. So don't let those feelings of perfectionism prevent you from exploring creative outlets if you don't already have one currently. So a friend of mine recently said, which I loved, you know, if you can play a note of music on an instrument, you can play music. If you can draw a line on a piece of paper, you can draw. It's really institutions that make us feel like we need to reach this certain arbitrary threshold to identify as a musician, an artist, whatever. And I think that grad students are particularly prone to feeling like, if I can't do this well, like I'm not going to do it at all. So I really encourage you to just do whatever you're drawn to, you know, paint, make music, download a meme app, cook a new recipe, dance, whatever you feel like doing. But something that I want to emphasize as well is that self-care strategies, I think, should really be paired with community care. So self-care and community care, I think, are very important to go hand in hand. I want us to consider what community care looks like for each of us as we wrap up this conversation. I think that being, you know, honest and open as you feel comfortable with, can go a long way in building community with your cohort and other grad students. So, you know, also lean on people you can have honest conversations about your mental health with, you know, friends, mentors, colleagues, what have you. A professor at VCU, B. Costin, also gave me the idea recently to have designated check-in friends, and they don't necessarily need to be other grad students. But, you know, a designated check-in friend can also function as an accountability buddy for the work that you're doing, to check in with each other about that. But a check-in friend can also just be, you know, you and a friend that clarify together how you'll be there for one another, you know, just to check in and be like, hey, I am not doing well today. I could really use some support. I could really use you, you know, holding space for me to, you know, talk about what's going on. making them dinner, things like that. Somebody that you have, you know, an established check-in pal relationship with. And I know that part of those feelings of wanting to seem together and also not wanting to burden people can prevent initiating conversations about mental health. I've been there for sure. But I will say that sharing experiences, you know, about not measuring up, imposter syndrome, and trying to identify your own mental health needs can be just as helpful and cathartic for the person that you're sharing those thoughts with. So also consider what counseling or therapy resources you have available to you. Building community with my cohort partially led me to therapy too, because they and other close people in my life were open about it and benefiting from it, you know, getting something out of it. And I think there's a stigma around therapy and medication because those things are seen as reserved for people, you know, who are weak or in really bad shape. But it takes strength to be vulnerable for sure. And come on, I mean, we can all benefit from getting perspective on our experiences, naming and processing emotions, and working through, you know, the impact of trauma on our growth as people and scholars. So I'm not saying that's easy work if you're going to go down that road, but it's, you know, it's actually very hard, but, you know, growth is difficult and worth it. So with that, I'd love to open it up for a larger conversation. And, you know, I have some discussion questions here. Feel free to comment on these or just share what's on your mind by using the raise hand function. And we can either unmute you, I believe, or you can type your comment into the chat box.